Hello everybody and welcome to Introduction to Statistics. Today we're going to discuss organizing qualitative and quantitative data, and we specifically are going to first look at the definition of statistics, probability, and some other key terms that are necessary to understanding statistics. Then we're going to look at the process of statistics. We will also distinguish between qualitative and quantitative variables, and also look at the difference between discrete and continuous variables. And the last thing we're going to do today is to organize and visualize qualitative data. We're going to discuss frequencies, frequency tables, relative frequency tables, and some graphs that we use to visualize qualitative data. So statistics is basically a science. So the science of statistics deals with the collection, analysis, interpretation, and presentation of data. So first we collect our data, analyze the data, interpret the results, and then visualize the data and present it. The organizing and summarizing of data is called the descriptive statistics. Two ways to summarize data are by graphing and using numbers, for examples, finding the average or the mean, finding the standard deviation. We will discuss all of this later. After you have studied probability and probability distributions, you will use formal methods for drawing conclusions from good data. Those formal methods are called inferential statistics, which is the last part of statistics. That is the interpretation of our data. Statistical inference uses probability to determine how confident we can be that our conclusions are correct. We will discuss this in the last few chapters of the semester. Probability. Probability is a mathematical tool used to study randomness. It deals with the chance or the likelihood of an event occurring. We will discuss probability superficially in this course, but we will see the power of mathematics through probability calculations and analyzing and interpreting our data based on our calculation. Some of the key terms that you need to understand in statistics are population. So when we say a population, we will be generally discussing the collection of people, things, or objects under specific study. Population doesn't mean always people. It could be a collection of things, collection of species. For example, a group of students is a population, or all of the students at CCD are a population of CCD students. The number of computers at the computer lab is a population. Maybe you're discussing the population of specific species of birds in Colorado. That is also a population. To study the population, we usually select a sample. The idea of a sampling is to select a proportion or a subset of the large population and study that proportion, which is the sample, to gain information about the population. Studying a population can be costly and it takes a lot of time. So in statistics, instead of studying the entire population all the time, we tend to select a subset of that population and we study that subset, which is the sample, and then we infer the results we get to the entire population. And that requires a good sampling method, which is we're going to discuss later. So what results of the sample is usually what we call the data. Data basically are information we collect from our sample or a population. Could be population, could be a sample. And the key element that you need to think about when you think about data is data varies. It is different from one population to another. It is different from one sample to another. It is actually different from one individual to another. An individual is basically one member of the sample or the population. We call that an individual. Again, that individual doesn't have to be a person. That individual could be a thing or an object. Okay. So when we say data varies, actually data varies even for one individual. Basically, if you're studying yourself, you don't sleep the same number of hours every day. That is the data that you can collect, which is the number of hours you sleep every day or every night. That varies from one day to another. So it's different from one individual to another, and it is different for one individual. So that is what we mean by the data varies. Examples for data that we can collect about from our sample or from our population could be the hair color, the height, maybe the weight. For example, if we discuss our class as a sample from CCD students, we can collect some data like age, we can collect gender, we can collect the height in inches, we can collect the type of car you drive, we can collect the number of children you have or the number of siblings you have. All of this information, when we collect it, is considered data. More key terms that you need to understand. If you collect a data from a sample and you collect and you compute a statistic, for example, the mean of your sample, we call that numerical measure that comes from the sample a statistic. So a statistic is basically a numerical measure that represents a property of the sample, which means it is a value that is computed from a sample. For example, if I wanted to collect the number of siblings you have, and I ask every individual in my sample, then I compute the average number of siblings for that sample, then that average or that mean is called a statistic. The statistic is basically an estimate of the population parameter. So if that information was computed for the population, we call it a parameter. It's no longer a statistic. It is going to be considered a parameter. For example, if I interviewed every single student as CCD, which is the population of students, and I asked them about how many siblings do you have, and then took the average or the mean for the number of siblings that CCD students have, that number is going to be a parameter. So a parameter is basically a number that is a property of the population or a number that is computed from the population data. The accuracy of this estimate depends on how well the sample represents the population. And this is a very, very important process that we need to focus on, which is choosing representative sample of our population. The sample must contain the characteristics of the population in order to be a representative sample. Unless the sample is representative, we will not be able to infer what we get from the sample into the population. Variables. What is a variable? A variable, usually we use uppercase letters to indicate that we're talking about a variable, is basically a characteristic of interest for each individual in the population. For example, if I have my population as my class of students, that is my population, I might identify some of the variables that I'm interested in. For example, the hair color of my students. That is a variable because it varies from one individual to another individual. I could identify the age as a variable, again, because it varies from one individual to another. I can identify another variable as the GPA of the student. I can identify endless variables about my students that I'm interested in. Those characteristics of interest we call variables. Some of these variables, you notice that they are numerical, and some of them were categorical. Of the examples I gave, numerical values could be the weight of the students, the age of the student. Categorical could be the eye color, the type of car they drive. So these are the two types of variables that we're going to discuss. So numerical variables take on values with equal units such as weight in pounds and time in hours and etc. Categorical variables place the individual into a category. For example, political affiliation, eye color, gender, ethnicity, etc. Data are the actual values of the variable. So when I say the eye color is brown, that is the data value. When I say the age of the person is 28, that is a data value. So the actual value of the variable is called the data. They may be numbers or words. Let's look at this example. Determine the key terms referred to in the following study. We want to know the average or the mean amount of money first-year college students spend at ABC College on school supplies that do not include books. We randomly surveyed 100 first-year students at the college. 3 of these students spent $150, $200, $225 respectively. We need to identify the population. As you can see from this question here, the population is all first-year students attending ABC College this term, because that is what the question is interested in. That is the population that this question is interested in. The sample is basically the 100 first-year students at ABC that were surveyed. That is our sample. The sample size is 100 in this case. The parameter, if we want to compute the parameter, it's going to be the average or the mean amount of money spent, excluding books, by first-year college students at ABC College this term. So all of the students, the average of the amount of money spent by all of the students this term at ABC College. That is the parameter. If we want to compute the statistic is basically the average mean amount of money spent, excluding books, by first-year students in the sample of 100 students that we chose. So that is the difference between parameter and statistic. Parameter is computed from the entire population. Statistic is computed from the sample. The variable identified in this specific situation is basically the amount of money spent, excluding books, by one first-year student. So that is our variable. What results from that variable is what we call the data. So if you collect some data from, let's say, 3 students and they spent $150, $200, and $225 respectively, then these amounts are an example for data. Let's look at another example. Determine what the key terms refer to in the following study. A study was conducted at a local college to analyze the average cumulative GPA of students who graduated last year. Fill in the letters of the phrases that best describe each of the items below. So the population in this case, notice how we want to analyze the average cumulative GPAs of students who graduated last year. So our population is going to be all students who graduated from the college last year. There is a similar but different sentence. Notice part A here says all students who attended the college last year, but that is not our population. We're not interested in all of the students who attended the college last year. We're only interested in those who graduated last year. So that is how you know that the difference between the first sentence A and sentence F. So number 1, the population is F, basically. Number 2, statistic. The statistic in this case is going to be the average cumulative GPA of students in the study who graduated from the college last year. So the average GPA that comes from the sample is going to be our statistic. That is what that sentence says. So number 2 is G. Number 3 is the parameter. So the parameter is going to be the average cumulative GPA of students who graduated from the college last year. So it comes from the entire population. It comes the GPA from the entire population, which is sentence E. So 3 is E. 4, the sample. The sample is going to be a group of students who graduated from the college last year, randomly selected. So that is our sample. We're going to take a group of the students who graduated last year and ask them about their GPA, and that is going to be our sample. So the sample is going to be D. D is a group of students who graduated from the college last year, randomly selected. That is very important that they are randomly selected. Number 5, we need to identify the variable. The variable here is the different GPA for one student. So the variable is going to be the cumulative GPA for one student who graduated from college last year. And that is sentence B. Lastly, the data. The data is basically numbers that represent GPA for some students. And that is C. C, as you can see here, 3.65, 2.80, 1.50, 3.90. All of these represent GPAs from individual students. The process of statistics. How do we conduct statistics usually? There are 4 main steps into statistics in this order. First step is identify the research objective, which means a researcher must determine the questions or the question they want answered. The questions must clearly identify the population that is to be studied. That is the first step, identifying the research objective and the research population. The second step is to collect the data needed to answer those questions, posed in step number 1. Conducting research on an entire population is often very difficult and expensive, so we typically take a look at a sample. This step is vital in the statistical process because if the data are not collected correctly, the conclusions drawn are meaningless. So step number 2 is to collect the data. Step number 3, after we collect this data, we're going to describe the data using descriptive statistics. So descriptive statistics allows the researcher to obtain an overview of the data and can help determine the type of statistical methods the researcher should use. The last step in the statistical analysis is the inferences. The inference step is the last step of statistical analysis, and we apply the appropriate techniques to extend the results obtained from the sample to the population and report a level of reliability of our results. We can say we are 90% confident that the population mean is, or the population, let's say, proportion of students who are first-generation college students at CCD is between, let's say, 50.3 and 65.7%. For example, we will discuss these steps again at the last few chapters of the semester. So now that we know the steps of the statistical process, we need to discuss the types of variables. Remember that we talked about variables and we said variables could be characteristics that are describing in the individual in words or numbers. So we know that variables can be qualitative and can be quantitative. So qualitative or categorical variables allow for classifications of individuals based on some attributes or characteristics. For example, the hair color is a qualitative variable. The blood type is a qualitative variable. Ethnic group is a qualitative variable. The car the person drives is a qualitative variable, and etc. Quantitative variables provide numerical measures of individuals. The values of quantitative variables can be added, subtracted, and they provide a meaningful results, meaning there is a quantity attached to them. For example, the amount of money, the pulse rate, the weight, the number of people living in your town, the number of students who take statistics, the number of siblings you have, the number of kids you have, and etc. So all of these have a quantitative value attached to them, a number. Okay, that's why we say this is quantitative variable. The list of observations a variable assumes is called the data. While gender is a variable, the observations, male or female, are the data we collect. While hair color is a variable, brown, yellow, red, blue, those represent the data. Blood type, A, B, O, etc. Those are the data. You get the point. So now, if you collect all of the qualitative data from a qualitative variable, then you're creating a set of qualitative data. So qualitative data is basically observation corresponding to a qualitative variable. And similar to that, quantitative data are observations corresponding to a quantitative variables. So for example, the number of cars your household have is a quantitative variable. We could have 2. Some students may have 2. Some students may have 3 in their household. Maybe some of you have 0 cars in their household. These numbers are called quantitative data. Quantitative data is going to be either discrete or continuous. So when we talk about numbers, there are 2 types of numbers: discrete and continuous. So if we look at quantitative variables, it could be a discrete variable, which is basically a quantitative variable that has either a finite number of possible values or a countable number of possible values. The term countable means the values result from the counting, such as 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. A discrete variable cannot take on every possible value between any 2 possible values. For example, if I asked about the number of siblings you have, that is a discrete variable. The data resulting from that discrete variable could be 0, 1, 2, 3. You can't say 1.5, 1.5. That is not a good answer for how many siblings you have. So because of that, we call this variable a discrete variable. And the data resulting from a discrete variable is called a discrete data. A continuous variable, on the other hand, is a quantitative variable that has an infinite number of possible values. It can take on decimals, you can say. So it's not countable. 1, 2, 3, 4. It can take on in between those values. For example, if I asked you how many grams of carbs do you eat per day, you're going to say maybe I eat 120.5 grams of carbs per day. Maybe some of you eat 10.9 grams of carbs per day. So these numbers, as you can see, they can take on in between solid values. They can be fractions, in other words. They can be fractions. So that is what we call continuous variable. The data that is collected from a continuous variable is called continuous data. Here is an example. Number 1.5. The data are the number of machines in a gym. You sample 5 gyms. One gym has 12 machines. One gym has 15 machines and another has 10 machines. One gym has 22 machines and the other one has 20 machines. What type of data is this? So this is going to be a quantitative data, and it is going to be quantitative discrete data. Quantitative discrete data. 1.6. The data are the areas of lawns in square feet. You sample 5 houses. The areas of the lawns are 145 square feet, 160 square feet, 190 square feet, 180 square feet, and 210 square feet. What type of data is this? This is quantitative again, but in this case, because we might have the possibility of fractions of feet, we're going to say this is continuous data, because you might have 144.5 square feet. It's a possibility. So this is discrete data, although the examples don't have any fractions, but we know in our real life we might have fractions. The last example here, the data are the colors of houses. You sample 5 houses. The colors of the houses are white, yellow, white, red, and white. What type of data is this? So this is qualitative data. Qualitative data or categorical data, because the data here is not numbers, it is words. Example 1.9. This is an activity that you can do in your groups. And since we're not in the classroom right now, I'm going to do this activity here with you. Please take notes. So we are given some data, and we need to determine whether the data is quantitative or qualitative, and whether it is continuous or discrete. So we're going to start with the first one. The number of pairs of shoes you own. This type of data is going to be, you guessed it, quantitative. And it is discrete. You can't have half a shoe. So it doesn't count. I mean, you can if your dog chewed on it, but it doesn't count. It's not a shoe anymore. So the first one is quantitative, and it is discrete. The type of car you drive, that is qualitative. And in qualitative data, we don't have discrete or continuous. That is just a characteristic of quantitative, the numbers. So part 2 or B, type of data here is qualitative or categorical. Qualitative and categorical are synonymous. Those are the same thing. Where you go on vacation, that is a place. It could be you go to a different state, maybe a different country. So that is going to be qualitative or categorical. The distance it is from your home to the nearest grocery store. That distance is going to be a number, and that number could be continuous, meaning it might have some fractions. It could be 2.5 miles, or maybe 6.7 miles, something like that. So for D, it's going to be quantitative, and it's going to be continuous. E, the number of classes you take per school year. That is a number, so it's going to be quantitative. And that number of classes is solid. It can't be a fraction, so it's going to be discrete. The tuition for your classes. The tuition for your classes is money, the amount of money you pay. That is going to be a quantity. So quantitative. And it could have fraction, it could have some sense, right? So it's going to be continuous. So continuous, quantitative, continuous. G, the type of calculator you use. So the type of calculator could be graphing calculator, could be scientific calculator, could be a basic calculator. So all of these are basically categories. So it's qualitative, doesn't have a number attached to it. So that is a qualitative or categorical. H, movie ratings. Movie ratings could be 1 star, 2 stars, 3 stars, 4 stars, 5 stars, if I understand that correctly. Now, if that is correct, then it's going to be quantitative. And because we can have 4.5 stars as a rating, I'm going to say this is continuous. Political party preferences. This is going to be qualitative, categorical. J, weights of sumo wrestlers. This is going to be quantitative. And since those wrestlers can have fractions on the scale when they weigh themselves. We're going to go with continuous. So the weights of sumo wrestlers is quantitative, and it is continuous data. The amount of money in dollars won playing poker. So specifically, it tells me the amount of money in dollars, which means no cents are included here. So it's going to be quantitative and it's going to be discrete, just because it mentioned to me that it's going to be in dollars. The number of correct answers on a quiz. So the number of correct answers is going to be quantitative. It could be 1 answer is correct, 2 answers are correct, 3 answers are correct. Depends on how many questions we have in the quiz. So you get the idea. You can't have half an answer that is correct, especially if it's like choose from multiples. You're going to only have 1 correct answer on a quiz. So I'm going to go with quantitative, and it is discrete. People's attitude toward the government. They're either satisfied, dissatisfied, they're mad, they're angry, and etc. And those are all qualitative variables because those are basically categories. The IQ scores. So the IQ scores are numbers usually. The IQ scores are going to be quantitative. It's not a label that you put on the person. So from that perspective, I'm going to say the IQ scores are quantitative. Example 1.10. A statistics professor collects information about the classifications of her students as freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. The data she collects are summarized in the pie chart below. What type of data does this graph represent or show? Since the data here represents labels of the students or categories of the students, this type of data is going to be qualitative or categorical data. Here's your hint. Whenever you see a pie chart, that is going to be qualitative or categorical data. You cannot use pie charts to represent quantitative data. We will discuss this later in this chapter. That leads us to number 5, organizing and visualizing qualitative data. So we're going to start with organizing and visualizing qualitative data. We will discuss organizing qualitative data in tables. Those are frequency tables and relative frequency tables. We're going to construct bar graphs for qualitative data. We have several types of bar graphs. And we're going to construct pie charts for qualitative data. When data is collected from a survey or designed experiment, they must be organized into a manageable form. Data is not organized, is referred as raw data. So when we say raw data, that means data that is not organized. We just asked our individuals, or we observed our individuals, and we collected some data and we have it raw. We did not organize it in tables. We did not do anything with that. So if you look at this table right here, it is a nice table and it's a good way of organizing and displaying the data, but graphs sometimes are more helpful to understanding our data. Although this represents a nice display of the college populations for 2 college populations here, De Anza College and Foothill College, it represents the number of full-time and part-time students and the total number of students and the percentage of each category for both of these schools. So again, these tables represent a nice organized data, but sometimes visualizing the data in graphs will be more helpful. We will discuss that as we move with the tools we're going to use to organize and visualize our data. The first way to organize our qualitative data is frequency distribution tables. A frequency distribution table lists each category of data and the number of occurrences for each category of data. For example, on the next slide, you're going to have the color of M&Ms in a bag of plain M&Ms. we want to construct a frequency distribution of the color of plain M&Ms. So this data right here, as you can see, is what you will collect once you take a look at the bag of M&Ms. So you're going to, let's say you sample, you take the first one, the first M&M, and you say, oh, it's a brown, and then you eat it. Oh, there is another brown, you eat it, and you record the color of that M&M. Okay, or maybe if you're like me, you don't like M&Ms, then you just trash it. You take the first one, oh, it's brown, and then trash it. Second one, brown, oh, trash it. Or maybe you just give it to your kid or your friend. So that is raw data. In order to organize this into a frequency table, we have two main columns. The first column is the color column, or the, you could say the category column. You record each color you observe once. You observe the brown ones, you record it. You observe the yellow ones, you record it. You observe the red ones, you record it. The orange ones, you record it. The blue ones, you record it. The green ones, you record it. If the color is not there, there's no need to record it. For example, if you don't see purple, don't say purple here. And then you're going to count how many brown M&Ms did you see in that bag. So if you count how many browns in this raw data, you're going to see 12 of them. How many yellow? 10. How many red? 9. How many orange? 6, and etc. There is no need to tally them, as we're going to use Excel, and I will show you in a separate video how to use Excel in order to organize raw data like this into a frequency table. The relative frequency table is another way of organizing your qualitative data. It is going to be created from the frequency table. The relative frequency is basically the frequency of the category divided by the sum of all frequencies, which is basically the sample size. The relative frequency distribution lists each category of the data with the relative frequency table. So here is our previous table that we created from the raw data, the color, the tally, and the frequency. That is what we did before. In order to create the relative frequency column, or the relative frequency table, first you're going to see how many M&Ms you have. So you're going to add all of the categories up. If you add these numbers, 12, 10, 9, 6, 3, you get 45. And then to find the relative frequency for brown color, or brown M&Ms, you're going to divide the number of brown M&Ms by the total number of M&Ms. Basically, you're figuring out the percentage of each of these colors. Visualizing qualitative data. There are two graphs that are used to visualize qualitative data. Those graphs are pie charts and bar graphs. We have 3 bar graphs that we're going to discuss in this course. The first graph is the frequency bar graph. The second one is a relative frequency bar graph, and then the side-by-side bar graph. So, if we look at pie charts, in a pie chart, categories of data are represented by wedges in a circle and are proportional in size to the percent of individuals in each category. For example, if you look at the percentage of full-time students and part-time students in De Anza College and Foothill College, which is the first example that I showed you previously, I can see here that the part-time students, the percentage of part-time students in De Anza school is bigger than the full-time students. And the proportion is huge compared to the part students when it comes to Foothill College. So, although the majority of the students in both colleges are part-time students, I can tell that the proportion of full-time students at De Anza's college is bigger than the Foothill College. So this is a good visual and a good representation of pie chart. If we have data like this, and this data, let's say, represents the marital status in millions of U.S. residents 18 years of age or older in 2006, we want to draw a pie chart from the data. Notice how this is going to be our frequency. So this is a frequency table. In order to create the pie chart, we need to turn it into relative frequency, although that is not very necessary in Excel, but this is the results when you use Excel. You're going to end up with percentages. So remember that the pie chart usually represents data from relative frequency. So the number 25% represents the percentages of never married people according to the previous data. So never married is 55.3 millions in the United States, and that is roughly 25% of the population. Bar graphs. A bar graph is constructed by labeling each category of data on either the horizontal or the vertical axis and the frequency or relative frequency of the category on the other axis. Rectangles of equal width are drawn for each category. The height of each rectangle represents the category's frequency or relative frequencies. And another thing you need to notice is those rectangles do not touch. So if we have this frequency table and we need to create a bar graph, we can use Excel, and I will show you in separate videos how to do that. You can create a bar graph. As you notice here, the category is written at the bottom, and then the height of that column represents the frequency of the color brown, which is 12 in this case. So the first color here, that means we have 12 brown M&Ms. The next one says we have 10 yellow M&Ms, and etc. And we have 3 blue M&Ms, and we have 5 green M&Ms. You could do it. You could do the categories on the horizontal and the frequency on the on the vertical and the frequency on the horizontal, but there is no need in this case. This fits just fine. Pareto charts. Pareto charts consist of bars that are sorted into order by category size, largest to smallest. So in this case, before we draw the bar graph using Excel, we're going to sort our data. I will show you in a separate video how to use Excel in order to create a Pareto chart. Side-by-side bar graphs. Suppose we want to know whether more people are finishing college today than 1990. We would draw a side-by-side bar graph to compare the data of the two different years. Data sets should be compared by using relative frequencies because different samples of population sizes make comparisons using frequencies difficult or misleading. For example, if you look at this data, this is comparing the, this following data represents the marital status in millions of U.S. residents 18 years of age or older in 1990 and 2006. We need to draw a side-by-side relative frequency bar graph for the data. So in this case, you must obtain a relative frequency table first, and then you're going to graph a side-by-side bar graph to compare the marital status between the 2 years or in the 2 years of 1990 and 2006. And this represents this data right here. So you can see that the light blue or the teal color represents the year 1990 and the dark blue represents the year 2006. And this is a good visual of the percentage of never married people in the United States in 1990 versus 2006, the married and the widowed and the divorced. So I can tell immediately that the percentage of never married people in the United States is bigger in 2006 than it is in 1990, while the married or the percentage of individuals married in 1990 is higher than 2006. So the comparison is using percentages in this case. It's not raw numbers. Again, part of that is because we don't want to study individuals in this case because obviously the population in 1990 of the United States was smaller than the population in 2006. Here is another way to represent the side-by-side bar graph. This is horizontal bars Bar graphs may also be drawn with horizontal bars in case you see the categories are lengthy. We don't have a space to put them at the bottom. So we put them on the side here on the vertical axis, so we have more space to represent the categories. So we're done with first part of Introduction to Statistics. If you do have any questions, please let me know. Make sure that you are referring back to the given resources, the book, to include more notes. This is basically a summary of the ideas that you need to look at in the book. You will need to do more reading on your own, and you will need to take more notes. And if you do have any questions, please let me know.